Pokémania didn't end at the games. They don't do bad by any stretch of the imagination, even today as the quality spirals, but Pokemon launched out of the gate as a multimedia franchise. Anime, manga, movies, plushies, and maybe, just maybe, most importantly were the cards. As a kid, how many of you knew how to play the game? Or knew someone who did? Don't lie. You had cards because the art was cool and didn't even pretend to know how the game worked, and the card train really hasn't stopped. Look at the horrendous spectator bubble YouTubers have turned Pokemon cards into. The TCG was a core pillar of Pokemon's early days, so what better way to advertise it than a Gameboy game? Actually force people to learn the game, tutorialize it, and potentially build the competitive scene. You got people dedicated to it if you pull it off. Pokemon trading card game was developed by Hudson Soft and originally released fairly late into the Game Boy's lifespan in 1998. It would also see a 2014 re-release on the 3DS and is pending a release on the Switch. Oh, yeah, I have to explain this game, don't I? Well, let's start with the cards and back up to the game. Keep in mind, I'm not an expert on this. The first time I ever played the Pokemon TCG was playing this game in a drunken stupor a month ago. Then again for this video. Although, I'm a Yu-Gi-Oh guy, if I can play that, I can play anything. That game is for fucking lawyers. In comparison, Pokemon trading card game is hopscotch. Before the game starts, each player puts the top 6 cards of their deck in the prize zone. Each time you knock out an opponent's Pokemon, you add one of these cards in your hand. Unlike Yu-Gi-Oh, cards are allowed to be at 4 copies per deck, so you run little risk of losing them all to prize cards. Whoever gets all their prizes first wins. Before turn 1, each player can put any amount of basic Pokemon they want onto the field, with a minimum of 1. If you have none, you need to shuffle and draw a new hand. Another victory condition is completely clearing your opponent's field of Pokemon. Basic Pokemon consist of the first stage of an evolutionary family or anything that doesn't evolve. Stage 1 is the first evolution and 2 is the final stage possible. Evolution is a very simple process. You just lay a monster on top of its prior evolution, while the prior evolution needs to have been on the field for an entire turn first. Turns are simple, consisting of 2 phases, setup and battle. In setup, you can play any number of basic monsters on the field, or evolve a basic monster if it's been on the field for a turn already. Use any number of abilities, activated effects Pokemon have that can apply generally useful effects. You can equip 1 energy card from your hand to a monster, and play as many trainer cards as you want. These are general purpose cards with a variety of different helpful effects, although at this point in the game, the relevant ones relate almost exclusively to drawing or searching, although they can also relate to other things like stunning your opponent via energy removal or forcing them to discard, as well as cheating evolution and other beneficial effects. I mean, basically, they can do whatever they say, just like a spell card in Yu-Gi-Oh! After finishing this first phase, there's the battle. It's very simple. You choose an attack that you have sufficient energy equipped for and use it. The energy isn't used up, so you can continue every turn to set up other stuff in the background. Moves deal damage with modifiers for weaknesses and resistances. Any Pokemon can technically be weak to any type, although they follow a general pattern and sometimes have additional effects, whether that's in the form of bonus damage, statuses, like Poison, which deals slight damage every turn, Paralysis, which makes a Pokemon incapable of retreating or attacking, Sleep, which prevents attacking but has a chance to cure at the end of each turn with a coin flip, and Confusion, which causes an attacking Pokemon to flip a coin before attacking and hurt itself for 30 damage on tails. I'll spend some time later discussing decks and strategies used by and against the player, just to save on clutter here. The AI in this game is actually quite good for a Game Boy trading card game. Even the Game Boy Advance Yu-Gi-Oh games had AI that didn't read their effects and turtled up against big numbers. Granted, that's a substantially more complex game with way more variety to the effects, but still, the AI here will set up Pokemon on their bench to the energy levels their evolutions need and even pull off more complex stuff like the Alakazam trick, redirecting damage to bulky but otherwise mostly useless Chansey to extend their life. It keeps the game interesting beyond the deck building that the AI can and will put up a pretty decent fight. All the game's best of one format can lead to some really wonky wins and losses when someone only starts with one fairly weak basic monster and gets steamrolled turn 2, but there's really not much you can do about that. That's just kind of the nature of this card game. This is all the card game stuff, or at least an overview, but this game is actually kind of an RPG as well. From the world map, there are about a dozen locations that can be chosen, mostly clubs for the various types, which contain trainers mainly using those types, but also a few non-battle areas that have other purposes, usually collecting cards in some fashion. Each building serves its own mini area full of NPCs to chat with their battle, either incidental battles or ones that are required to challenge the leader for one of their medals. Once all 8 are collected, the endgame is opened up. Battling trainers, mandatory or not, gives packs which contain 10 cards each, split between 4 sets that evenly divide the game's cards, seemingly without much of a theme, slowly expanding the available card pool as you play. The player can also store several decks at a time for the purpose of experimentation and counterplay, which is a pretty neat feature that these card games don't tend to include, or at least didn't at this time. There truthfully isn't a lot to the overworld. They're fairly small and straightforward, and the clubs don't have puzzles or anything, but it still makes the game a little more immersive to explore, and there are occasional surprises. People who want to trade cards, Imakumi, a random opponent who sometimes shows up to battle and gift you terrible joke cards when you beat him, who's based on a card designer and musician from the Pokemon series, and battles with your rival Ronald every few times you beat a club. I think that's kind of enough background for now. In a moment I'll talk about some decks and strategies and stuff, but I don't think there's any need to get into that right away. Interestingly, this game actually reuses some overworld sprites for its characters from the mainline game. This is the only spin-off game that's ever done this as far as I'm aware. The overworld looks fine enough. The world map is large and colorful, although without flourish. More impressive are sprites and duels. Character portraits all look nice, although the designs tend to be a touch generic. But the real treat is the card art. Beautifully digitized despite the extreme limitations on color for this game, somehow wonderfully capturing the art style of these classic pieces of card art in only 4 colors. Some hold up a little less than others, but many of them are quite impressive. You could call the menus and playing field a little bland, but they're pretty utilitarian. They cram a ton of information onto tight spaces very efficiently and in ways that ensure you always have all the information you need. While the game's music is very good, I would say it's a bit generic, and to be fair, I don't know how I'd make card game music either. But the title theme is basically some Dragon Quest shit, and while there's appreciable music variety in the overworld, it's more or less just basic, nice overworld music. The worst element to the game is the normal dueling theme, the one you'll hear the most, which, while a very good song and very fun to listen to the first 20 times, gets repetitive pretty quick because almost every duel in the game uses it. It also doesn't really have a high energy to it, even though I like the song. I think it's better to listen to alone than it is to actually listen to as a part of the game. The special themes for club leaders Ronald and the Grandmasters capture the energy a bit better and are very appreciable breaks from the standard music, but the game feels like it needs 2 or 3 different themes for standard duels to break it up a little bit. I still think all the music in the game is really good, and the quality is off the charts, especially given how hard it was to make music for the Game Boy. I just wish there was a bit more variety in duels and a bit more energy at times. I'm not really going to touch on clubs. A lot of the leaders use some variety of the decks I talk about, although I'll try to touch on the main decks of the game and some interesting deck building stuff. As such, I'll largely be covering decks by type. This game only covers the first 3 core sets, so there isn't much to build into as far as boss monsters go yet, which means a lot of decks of a certain type are going to kinda end up at the same point. Let's start at grass. In the interest of condensing the amount of energy in this game down, a lot of types are condensed together. The game would be a headache if it had 17 different energy types to balance, plus it allows non-mono decks to have some ability to resist different types and to more effectively stop counters. As such, grass condenses down grass, obviously, bug, and poison. Pokemon based on grass and bug types tend to be weak to fire, while the ones based on poison tend to be weak to psychic, and grass moves tend to hit fighting types based on ground or rock Pokemon harder, as well as some water types. The Grass Club uses Pokemon based on grass and bugs types, while the Science Club uses Pokemon based on poison types. The grass strategy tends to revolve around status, poison and paralysis especially, spreading these early and often to gain advantage and boost damage. The big boss of grass at this stage in the game is Venusaur, of course, whose energy transfer ability lets it move grass energy between any Pokemon in your field. As you set things up, you can rip energy off of weaker stuff to charge up the big guys, or rescue the energy from a Pokemon on the verge of knockout, as recovering cards from the discard pile is very rare. Grass's big problem is generally low power. Venusaur hits hard, but its attack has a high energy cost and lacks an effect. Nidoking can spread toxic poison, which deals additional damage each turn, but lacks power. Nidoqueen gets stronger for each Nidoking on the bench, which is a fun gimmick, but requires immense setup. Victory Bell can force an opponent to switch or prevent them from switching, letting it control the field, but it also lacks power. Venomoth and Executor do some massive damage, but are very reliant on coin flips. Muck shuts off other Pokepowers, which is really powerful control, but also limits your own. And Weezing's self-destruct is powerful, but takes itself with it. There's a generally good amount of control in grass decks, but they sometimes struggle to capitalize on that control, and you either need to heavily maintain it via good coin flips or by making a hybrid deck with a harder hitting type. Typically Psychic, as they tend to be somewhat low committal, and the other types kinda have better places to be. Although Fighting is also a really solid filler type, as I'll discuss shortly. It's also worth noting that there's a second Venusaur in this game, although its promotional status means it's somewhat limited to Card Pop, which is a multiplayer only feature that allows you to get promo cards. It's a sort of mystery gift that required using the Game Boy's infrared sensor with another player, so good luck getting that very often. Fire is not a very good type. As you'd expect, Fire tends to be weak against water and strong against grass, and is represented by the Fire Club as well as one of the members of the Grand Masters. Fire types tend to have very high power, but at very high cost, typically in the form of discarding attached energy. A real ball buster when recovering energy is so difficult, forcing you to run an excess of slow, cloggy energy to operate. Most decks can skirt by at just under 20 energy in their 60 card decks, 15-ish monsters, and load the rest up with generic trainers. Bill lets you draw 2, Professor Oak discards your hand to draw 7, Energy Search can dig for energy, and you can run 4 of each of these. You don't want to be loading up on 30 energy for the most part. Take Charizard, the first boss of the Fire type. Its ability doesn't generate or transfer anything, just treats whatever random energy it has on it as fire. Useful sometimes, but it doesn't support the general playstyle of the type, especially because it's so discard heavy. Its attack does an absurd 100 damage, but every time it's used it discards 2 fire energy, effectively only allowing it to attack every other turn. It's a lot of work, especially when Venusaur can do 120 in 2 turns for way less work. Ninetales is much more reasonable, doing slightly less damage for 1 discard, and Arcanine has an attack that doesn't discard, it just does recoil because of course. Moltres should be great, it's a basic you can dump right onto the field, but it has 2 options. A powerful attack with a coin flip chance to do literally nothing, and discarding energy to mill your opponent's deck. Powerful for sure, but a lot of effort. The few fire that don't discard at all, like Rapidash, tend to have extremely low damage output. Probably the only card that actively supports this energy-dense playstyle properly is the promo Moltres, which can search up to 4 fire energy from the deck to your hand on the turn it's played. How do I choose randomly how many to search? A 4-sided die? And even then, this Moltres has the same shitty coin flip attack as the other one, plus you can only place 1 energy a turn, which means you're still stuck on some kind of limit to how often you can attack. Fire hypothetically likes being paired with Electric. It fucks off the waters that threaten them, and like Psychic has a number of low commitment cards. That said, Fire decks are already so energy dense that they have very little room to spare for an entire extra type and its energy. Fire is far and away the most difficult type in this game to make an even halfway functional deck for, and it's really not even fun to use if you attempt to. To complete the starter trifecta, Water, which also condenses down Ice. Given most Ice are also Water in this generation, it matters very little, and the only Pokemon purely representing Ice, Articuno, has no weakness. This type is represented both in the Water Club and via one of the Grandmasters for its Ice typing. Water is most often weak to Electric, although a few are instead weak to Grass and tend to be strong against Fire. Water's playstyle is a bit vague. A number of them get more powerful the more energy you have attached, which is an effect on Water Gun and Hydro Pump, and the half-ice ones spread Paralysis as a substitute for freezing, although in general they play into swarming, setting up a ton of stuff at once thanks to their boss. In the competitive scene, one of the best decks of the era was Rain Dance, named after Blastoise's ability, which frees water of the 1 energy a turn limit. If you have energy, you can keep attaching it, and you can set up a lot of shit at once through that, especially when combined with cards like Bill and Oak Deep Draw, just to keep flushing and refilling your hand for more and more energy. Blastoise itself can only boost its attack to an okay 60, but various other waters can do the heavy lifting after Blastoise sets up. Gyarados and Dugong require relatively low setup and have a paralysis chance. Poliwrath and Golduck can strip energy from the defending Pokemon. Starmie can discard water energy to heal itself if it needs to. Articuno has a chance to deal small amounts of damage to Pokemon on the bench, stifling comebacks. Tentacruel has Confusion Poison, and the promo Articuno can paralyze Pokemon when put into play, plus deals decent damage to an opponent's Pokemon at random, sometimes stifling the bench. The sheer power of Rain Dance, ease of setup, and huge pool of options and tools makes this probably the best deck in this game, maybe second to something a little more strange. Fighting is also a fantastic partner here, as it's already an insanely good type in its own right, but it also helps get rid of the electrics that threaten you before the Rain Dance truly begins. Water's an extremely flexible deck, which makes it extremely fun to build. Beyond its centerpiece Blastoise, you have a lot of options for sheer force, control, or something in between. It doesn't hurt that it's a choice for a starter deck. Grass, Fire, and Water all are, but I've discussed those decks, and Water is the easiest choice, and powerful enough once you start opening packs to carry you through the entire game with ease. In fact, I pretty much start to finish just used Rain Dance. Psychic represents both Ghost and Psychic and is seen in the Psychic Club and have a lot of unique quirks. Psychics based on Psychics tend to be weak to Psychic, I assume to represent their Ghost weaknesses, while the Ghosts, all 3 of them, lack a weakness and resist fighting, making them fantastic stall tools. Offensively, Psychic obviously counters itself, but also fighting. The Psychic playstyle is ironically a bit unclear. A lot of them play with Confusion and Sleep, but others play with Energy Manipulation, getting stronger with each energy their opponent has on their monster, while others still play Defense, either preventing damage or transferring damage around. There's a lot on the plate which makes the deck versatile but complicated to build, although the fact that it only fears a mirror match is a strong benefit. The first true boss of the Psychics was Alakazam, whose ability let it rearrange all the damage counters on your side of the field during your turn. This allowed you to dump damage onto something like Chansey or Snorlax to give any of your Psychics substantially more survivability, as they just have these damage batteries. In the same set, Mewtwo also dropped, and it gets more powerful as the opponent sets up, hitting 10 damage for each energy attached to the opponent. Powerful against big setup decks like Rain Dance. Jinx is another great basic whose attack raises for each damage counter on the opponent, which makes it serve as a nice revenge killer. And Mr. Mime has a weaker version of the same trick, but also can't be damaged by moves that would do more than 20 damage to it, which means if your opponent sets up fully before Mr. Mime comes out, they can have a real difficulty getting rid of it. Meanwhile, for the Ghost, Gengar is basically the anti-Alakazam, allowing you to move damage from one of your opponent's Pokemon to another once a turn. It's slow, but it can add up over time. Mewtwo and Mew also have promos. The Mewtwo promo can recover energy from the discard and attach them to itself, while Mew is immune to damage and the effects of evolved Pokemon, only vulnerable to basics, although it's extremely weak otherwise. Like I said, you got options. It's a difficult deck to make work because it's all over the place and pretty reliant on frail basics, but the Alakazam deck has a good amount of potential to maintain strong advantage through healing and defense. A Psychic deck's strongest partner is probably Electric, as before it's low commitment and neutral Psychic onslaughts. Electric is an oddball type. To an extent it lacks a true deck of its own. It can be a great support type, but it lacks a strong boss. Like Fire, this deck appears in its own club, the Lightning Club, and as one of the Grandmasters. Electric are weak to fighting and generally strong against water, as well as Pokemon that are in the mainline games partially flying type. Electric's primary playstyle is something of a twist on Fire's. Big damage, but while also having to flip coins for the chance at severe recoil. Not to mention a little bit of paralysis on the side, and a few that do damage to bench Pokemon as they attack. Unfortunately, they also tend to require some huge energy investments that make them hard to run as a deck, especially since they focus so heavily on basic Pokemon. The best boss we got here is Zapdos. 2 strong moves, but one has a harsh recoil chance and the other requires discarding all of its energy to use. There are others, but really Electric needs some kind of ability it just doesn't have. Electrode can sacrifice itself to become 2 energy of any type, but doing so gives your opponent a prize, and looking through the rest, Magneton can blow itself up for some okay damage to the opponent and their bench, Raichu is a worse Zapdos, and the other Electrode does really weak damage to your opponent's whole field. The second Zapdos can blow through the bench but risks hurting itself really badly. The second Raichu hits everything weakly. The deck's only truly reasonable card is Electabuzz, a really solid basic with low energy costs for a decent 30 or 40 power move and a weaker move with a paralysis chance, which help form the basis of the Haymaker deck I'll talk about shortly. The promo Zapdos is also hilarious as it just shoots out damage at random on summon and when using its huge attack. Unless it's your only Pokemon, you have to be prepared to lose a lot of your own using its attacks, but on an empty field it can be a real menace. Largely on account of its lack of abilities, Electric isn't much of a deck at this point. You need to put in an insane amount of effort to slowly, or sometimes if you're unlucky, very quickly kill yourself. It can be a solid support type, especially Electabuzz, but even compared to Fire it's a very difficult deck to get the ball rolling on. Fighting is probably the most interesting type in this game, covering Fighting, Rock, and Ground, and has 2 clubs, the Rock Club and Fighting Club. The ones based on fighting types are weak to Psychic, while the ones based on the other 2 types are weak to Grass. And the type is strong against both Electric and Colorless. Hitting Colorless especially shuts down a lot of good generic stuff the decks run. Fighting is home to medium damage stuff. Not nearly the sheer force as Fire and Electric are, but also lacking the drawbacks of those types. A solid middle ground that makes Fighting a generally splashable type. Hitmonchan is probably the best singular card in this game. 70 HP on a basic Pokemon with a 1 energy, 20 attack moves that deals double on Electric and normal, and up to 40 damage on its second attack. It's an incredibly easy, bulky, and powerful early option to shut games down super early, and can fit in any deck that can afford to throw in 2 or 3 fighting energy. Not to mention form the backbone of Haymaker with Electabuzz, a powerful basic-centric deck that used these 2 to shut down battles super fast before they could even start. Machamp is a lot of work, but the counter damage whenever it's attacked is funny and it hits hard when set up. Dugtrio does massive damage, but deals some to your own bench too, fine if you don't have one. Marowak can set up the bench from the deck even if its attack is a coin flip. Rhydon forces switches, Hitmonlee can just directly attack the bench, and Golem requires a lot of energy but hits like a truck. There's also the fossils, which are interesting in their own rights. All of their basic forms evolve from an item card called the Mysterious Fossil that treats itself as a basic. This kind of clunky gimmick for them gives them a decent amount of versatility to pivot into whatever you need when you have it. Although only Aerodactyl is truly notable as it prevents both players from evolving Pokemon, a ridiculously fucked up lockdown that can basically end the game on the spot against certain setup-reliant decks. Fighting can serve itself well as a decent mid-power deck, especially centered on the real gut punchers like Hitmonchan, but more than anything has a lot of fairly generic power boosters for basically any other deck, water especially, for reasons I discussed earlier. The hardest part about a pure deck is that they lack the speed boosters of grass and water, instead just being raw damage machines with straightforward setup, which is somewhat mitigated by some big powerhouse basics. Lastly, Colorless represents normal dragon and flying, kind of, and lacks a club, but the last of the Grandmasters uses dragon. Flying is weird as it mostly serves as a subtype, but depending on fighting resistance any Pokemon with the flying type in the games, including non-colorless ones like Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres. Colorless has a number of unique quirks. It lacks its own basic energy, although there is a special double colorless energy that provides two colorless, as any energy can be used in the place of colorless. As you'll see on many cards, it requires some amount of their own energy, and then can generically use whatever to fill in the colorless gaps to better facilitate multi-type decks. As such, most colorless Pokemon are perfectly generic and can be slotted into most any deck, and often offer generic utility in some form, be that drawing, searching, or a little extra muscle, but they often suffer from being fairly weak offensively to compensate. Colorless also lacks a type weak to it or resisted by it, meaning it can generically get in against most anything. The most notable colorless monster is Wigglytuff, whose absurd power catapulted it to the top of the meta. Do the Wave gains 10 power for every monster you have on your bench, 60 damage with a full bench completely neutrally on anything and everything. The strongest colorless deck, but also a great asset for the swarm heavy water decks and almost any other deck that just plops down monsters on the field. Other notables include Chansey, which is a fairly unimpressive Pokemon whose 120 HP is integral in Alakazam decks, Porygon, incapable of doing damage, but a great staller by changing its own weakness and resistance, Raticate, who can hit hard for very minimal setup but is incredibly frail, Clefable, who can use opponents' attacks against them for very little cost, Kangaskhan, who has a 1 energy attack that does nothing but draw a card that can help with deep draw early on, Pidgeot, who can force switches, Dragonite, which can switch itself for no cost and is a bulky hitter, although Dragon is fairly weak right now, and of course Eevee, who can use its evolution gimmick in multi-type decks centered on fire, water, electric to pivot into whatever suits its needs at the time. Wigglytuff alone can make a suitable boss for colorless-centric decks, as can the powerful other options like Kangaskhan, but it's clearly not part of their design. These are generic good stuff that can be mashed into most any deck, Wigglytuff and Kangaskhan especially, which can be blessings for virtually any kind of deck. Beyond the decks and deck building, there isn't a lot to say about what you actually do in the game. Clubs use decks that more or less serve as the standard version of their types, which I talked about above, and the Grandmasters use decks based around Articuno, Zapdos, Moltres, and Dragonite. They serve to be the final challenge of the game before Ronald's. Ronald uses various decks in the game. His first is a dreadful fire-water hybrid, his second is a less effective Haymaker, and his final deck that he uses after you defeat the Grandmasters is a true clunker of a deck utilizing all 3 legendary birds, Dragonite and Eevee, and mixing 3 different types of energy into one titanic clusterfuck. And upon defeating him, all that's left is the Challenge Cup. 3 random trainers in a row to have a shot at getting some promo cards. Pokemon Trading Card is a great trading card game. It's satisfying to tie it into the RPG format. You get a good sense of progression building your collection to open up more possibilities for deck building, and while the card sets are rather limited, being based on only the first 3 sets of the game, there's a good bit of variety in both the decks you can build and the decks you go against. The shockingly great AI is a good tool for learning how the games work, and taught me better than most online guides could have in a very entertaining manner. I'm sure many kids actually learn the game this way, and while it's far from my favorite card game, lacking the complexity of Magic the Gathering or the sheer insanity of Yu-Gi-Oh!, I've developed a greater appreciation for this relatively simple little card game, and I think like a lot of Pokemon stuff, it's a great entry-level exploration of the card game genre. I thoroughly enjoy this game. It's an extremely high quality and easy to play adaptation of a card game, even more so than Yu-Gi-Oh! Games often were at the time that this was released. It's shocking that there was never a follow-up to this. Hell, I would expect fairly regular follow-ups to immortalize the different eras of this card game too. But what can you do? What? Japanese only, English patch, 3 additional sets. Is Rain Dance still good? Well, I'm not sure when, but eventually I'll have to take a look at this game's follow-up too. Pokemon Trading Card Game is a great game, a fantastic card game, a great way to learn this card game. Play it, have a blast, and gain a bit of an appreciation for this little card game as I did.